Chapter 1. The Forbidden Signal. Orford Ness had always been a place of mystery. Located on a desolate spit of land on the Suffolk coast, it was once used by the British military for testing secret technologies and conducting experiments during the Cold War. Now, it was abandoned, a ghost of its former self, with crumbling buildings, rusting towers, and the eerie silence of the past echoing through the salty air. Despite its history, most considered it nothing more than a decaying relic of Britain's military legacy. But for James Conway, it was something more. A renowned researcher of electromagnetic phenomena, James had always been obsessed with the mysteries of Orford Ness. Something about the place had drawn him in for years: the tales of strange broadcasts, odd signals that defied explanation, and the occasional whispers of UFO sightings. His colleagues dismissed these rumors as nothing more than conspiracy theories, but James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Orford Ness than met the eye. That was why, after securing a grant from a private foundation, James found himself standing on the cold, windswept shore of Orford Ness, his boots sinking into the wet sand as the old lighthouse loomed in the distance. The place was eerie, to say the least. The tide seemed to hum, as if something just beneath the water's surface was pulsing with energy, and the wind carried a low, almost melodic tone. "Let's get started," James muttered, pulling out a handheld electromagnetic field detector. The device hummed softly, its needle twitching in response to the environment around him. He made his way toward the site of the old radio towers, where some of the most classified tests had taken place decades ago. If there was any remnant of the mysterious signals, it would be here. As he approached the rusting skeleton of a long-forgotten tower, something strange happened. The detector began to spike wildly, its needle bouncing erratically. James stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. He adjusted the frequency settings, thinking there might be interference from some hidden power source or metal structure nearby. But no, the readings were coming from the air itself. Suddenly, the wind seemed to die down. The sky, once cloudy and dull, grew darker, as if a shadow had passed over it. James glanced up, and that's when he heard it: the signal. It wasn't a sound, at least not in the traditional sense, but more like a vibration that resonated deep in his bones. His teeth chattered involuntarily as the energy grew stronger, radiating from somewhere unseen. The hum became more distinct, growing louder, and soon he could make out a rhythm, like a coded message. Frantically, James fumbled with his recorder, trying to capture the signal. This was it, the evidence he had been searching for. But as the signal grew stronger, something else happened. The landscape around him seemed to shift. The distant lighthouse flickered, as if caught between two moments in time. His vision blurred for a second, and when it cleared, he was no longer standing in the Orford Ness he knew. The world had changed. The crumbling remains of the tower were now intact, shining with a strange, metallic luster. The sky, which had been overcast just moments before, was now a swirling mass of deep red and purple hues. The air smelled different, too stale, metallic, as if it had been sealed away for centuries. And then, in the distance, James saw them. Figures. Human-shaped but not quite human. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the red sky. James' breath caught in his throat as they turned their heads toward him in unison, their faces featureless and cold. Panic surged through him, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The signal in his ear grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to communicate something he couldn't understand. The figures began to move toward him, slowly at first, but then faster, their limbs bending in ways that made James' stomach turn. He had to get out. He had to escape. With every ounce of strength he could muster, James tore himself away from the spot, sprinting back toward the shore. His heart pounded in his chest as the world around him continued to warp and shift, the sky growing darker, the figures gaining on him. He didn't dare look back, afraid of what he might see. Finally, after what felt like hours, James stumbled onto the wet sand of the beach, gasping for air. The lighthouse flickered back into existence, and the sky returned to its dreary gray. The signal had stopped, but James knew what he had seen was no hallucination. Whatever had happened at Orford Ness, it was far more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. Chapter 2. The Vanished. Back in his small research station, James paced the floor, trying to make sense of what had happened. The strange occurrence at Orford Ness haunted him. The readings on his devices were erratic. The signal defied any conventional understanding of physics, and his encounter with the figures left him shaken to the core. His mind raced as he replayed the event in his head over and over. He saw the distorted figures moving toward him, their unnatural forms imprinted in his memory like a brand. Every instinct told him that he had brushed against something far beyond the ordinary, something that had crossed the boundaries of space and time. Sitting down at his cluttered desk, James turned his attention to the recordings he had captured during his visit. He pressed play, and the audio played back through his headphones, the hum, the strange pulsating rhythm, the eerie signal that seemed to vibrate in and out of reality. There was no mistaking it. The signal wasn't just an anomaly. It was a message. He adjusted the frequency levels on his recorder, hoping to pull out some kind of pattern, but the signal remained elusive, its nature slipping through his grasp like water through his fingers. It wasn't like anything he had encountered before, not the electromagnetic noise that military equipment usually produced. It was deeper, almost biological, as if it were alive. Frustrated, James sent the recording to some of his most trusted colleagues, hoping someone might recognize its properties. He attached a note, asking for any insights they might have about the signal, emphasizing the urgency of his discovery. Time passed, but no responses came. Days turned into a week, and the silence from his colleagues felt heavy. It wasn't like them not to respond, especially to something as bizarre and groundbreaking as this. And then, something even stranger happened. People began to vanish. It started with local fishermen, who often worked near the shores of Orford Ness. James first heard about it from the bartender at the local pub, who mentioned how one of the more experienced fishermen had gone missing. No one thought much of it at first. The coastlines could be treacherous, and it wasn't unheard of for accidents to happen at sea. But the man's boat was found abandoned, floating eerily close to the shore, with no sign of its owner. Days later, another person vanished. This time, it was the lighthouse keeper, a woman who had taken care of the now automated lighthouse for years. She lived alone, a quiet soul who had no reason to disappear suddenly. When the authorities went to check on her, they found her house exactly as she had left it, nothing disturbed, nothing packed. Her car still sat in the driveway, keys in the ignition, as if she had planned to return at any moment. James couldn't ignore the growing dread that settled deep in his gut. The disappearances were too close to what he had experienced. He pulled out old maps of Orford Ness, combing through decades of history in search of answers. What he discovered was disturbing. Orford Ness had been the site of numerous unexplained incidents over the years, incidents that had never been widely publicized. Strange lights had been reported in the sky, odd readings had baffled scientists, and there were rumors of secret experiments conducted during the Cold War. James knew about the military testing, of course, but there was something else, something buried in the classified documents he had managed to access over the years. The name of one experiment caught his eye, Project Tempest. Conducted in the early 1970s, the experiment had focused on the manipulation of electromagnetic fields, specifically their impact on temporal structures. The scientists involved had theorized that certain frequencies could distort time itself. What started as a simple research project had spiraled into something far more dangerous. The declassified documents only offered a few details, heavily redacted and sanitized. But one account, written by a scientist involved in the project, suggested they had succeeded in opening what they referred to as a rift. The exact nature of the rift was unclear, but the report hinted at something far more sinister than a mere tear in the fabric of time. The language used was cryptic, but one sentence stood out. "We closed the rift immediately, but something came through." James felt a chill run down his spine as he read that line. The document didn't explain what had come through, but the urgency in the scientist's report was unmistakable. Project Tempest had been shut down soon after, the research buried, and the site abandoned. But whatever had happened back then had left its mark on Orford Ness. And now, it seemed, that mark was resurfacing. James' thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing on the desk. It was a call from a colleague, Sarah, one of the few people he trusted with sensitive information. He quickly answered. "Sarah, thank God you called. Did you get my email?" James asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "I did," Sarah replied, her tone serious. "But James, you need to stop. You're getting into something dangerous." "Dangerous? What do you mean?" "There's a reason no one's responding. Your signal—it's been flagged. People are disappearing for a reason. James? I've been looking into it since you sent me the file. Whatever you're dealing with, it's not just electromagnetic noise. It's something older, something not meant to be tampered with. James felt his heart sink. Sarah, you're scaring me. You should be scared. I'm not the only one who's seen this kind of thing. There are records, things kept out of the public eye. Orford Ness is a gateway, James. The signal you picked up is part of a larger system. I don't know how much of it is true, but there are stories about people who get too close. They vanish. Just like those people in the village. James ran his hand through his hair, the weight of Sarah's words settling in. What do I do? Get out of there. Delete everything you've gathered. Don't follow this any further. But James couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after everything he had uncovered. He thanked Sarah for her warning, but deep down, he knew he couldn't walk away. Something was happening at Orford Ness, something beyond the realm of understanding. And now, with the disappearances piling up and the growing sense of an impending revelation, he felt as if he were on the brink of discovering the truth. Yet as night fell and the wind howled outside his research station, James couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. Chapter 3. The Hidden Gate. Despite Sarah's urgent warnings, James found himself drawn back to Orford Ness. The mysterious signal and the vanishing people were a puzzle he couldn't walk away from. He had spent the better part of his life chasing answers in the field of electromagnetic phenomena, and now, he was closer than ever to a revelation that could change everything. But deep down, a darker thought nagged at him. What if Sarah was right? What if he was meddling with forces far beyond human understanding? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the abandoned site, James made his way back to the heart of Orford Ness. The wind whipped through the derelict structures, carrying with it the faint hum that had haunted him since his first visit. He checked his equipment one last time, ensuring his devices were operational. If he was going to find answers, tonight was the night. As he approached the area where he had first detected the signal, something unusual caught his eye. The air shimmered faintly, as if rippling with invisible energy. James raised his electromagnetic detector, and sure enough, the needle spiked wildly, even more erratically than before. The signal was stronger now, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to resonate in his bones. He followed the sensation, his heart pounding in his chest. The landscape around him seemed to blur, just as it had before. But this time, he didn't feel the disorientation he had experienced during his first encounter. Instead, it was as if the world around him was gradually fading away, revealing something beneath it, something hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath his feet. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself had become dense with unseen forces. And then, before his eyes, the shimmering intensified, forming what could only be described as a doorway, a gate. The gate was a swirling vortex of light and shadow, pulsating with energy that felt both alien and ancient. It wasn't like anything James had ever seen, not even in the wildest scientific theories. The edges of the gate seemed to ripple, bending space itself as it hung in the air before him. This was it, the source of the signal, the thing that had drawn him to Orford Ness in the first place. For a moment, he hesitated, his mind racing with the implications of what he was seeing. Could this really be a doorway between dimensions? A rift in the fabric of reality? He had read about such things in theoretical physics papers, but none of it seemed real until now. James took a deep breath, gathering his courage. He had come this far, he couldn't turn back now. Slowly, he approached the gate, his heart hammering in his chest. As he stepped closer, the hum grew louder, almost deafening, and he could feel the energy tugging at him, pulling him toward the unknown. With one final step, James crossed the threshold. The world around him shifted instantly. Gone was the desolate landscape of Orford Ness. Instead, he found himself standing in a vast, dimly lit chamber, its walls made of some kind of smooth, metallic substance that gleamed faintly in the dim light. The air here was heavy, thick with a strange, otherworldly scent. It felt like being deep underground. Yet there was no sense of confinement, just an overwhelming sense of being in a place that was not meant for human eyes. In the center of the chamber stood a massive structure, towering over him like a monolith. It was cylindrical in shape, covered in intricate patterns and symbols that glowed faintly with a pale, greenish light. The symbols looked almost familiar, like a language on the edge of recognition, but James couldn't place them. As he stared at the structure, he felt a presence. He wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he turned slowly, his pulse quickening. Standing at the far end of the chamber were figures tall, humanoid shapes cloaked in shadow. Their eyes glowed faintly, the only feature visible on their otherwise featureless faces. They stood perfectly still, as if waiting. A cold sweat broke out on James' forehead. These were the same figures he had seen during his first encounter at Orford Ness, the ones that had chased him. But now, there was no sense of urgency in their movements. They simply watched him, their glowing eyes following his every move. James felt a wave of panic rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had come too far to turn back now. Slowly, he raised his hands, trying to show that he meant no harm. But the figures made no move to acknowledge his gesture. Instead, one of them began to move, gliding toward the monolith in the center of the room. As the figure approached the structure, it placed a hand on its surface. Instantly, the symbols flared to life, glowing brighter with an intense, greenish light. The hum in the air grew louder, more insistent, and the ground beneath James' feet began to tremble again. The monolith began to pulse, sending waves of energy rippling through the chamber. James staggered back, struggling to keep his balance as the vibrations grew stronger. The figures, however, remained unaffected, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The air grew still, heavy with anticipation. James held his breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, with a sound like the cracking of thunder, the monolith split open. A blinding light poured from within, flooding the chamber with its brilliance. James shielded his eyes, but even through the light, he could see what was happening. From the heart of the monolith, something was emerging, something large, dark, and shifting in the light. It was a form, massive and amorphous, its surface writhing and changing as it took shape. Tendrils of shadow extended from it, reaching out like the arms of some ancient, forgotten god. The light flickered, casting strange, jagged shadows across the chamber. James' breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. The thing that had come through the rift wasn't just a presence, was alive. The tendrils stretched out, searching, probing the air as if testing the boundaries of its new environment. The figures stood motionless, seemingly unafraid of the creature that now dominated the chamber. But James could feel the air grow colder, the presence of the creature suffocating, oppressive. Suddenly, one of the tendrils lashed out, moving with blinding speed. It struck the ground near James, sending up a shower of sparks as it made contact with the metallic floor. James scrambled backward, his heart racing. The creature seemed to sense him now, its tendrils moving with purpose, searching for him. Without thinking, James turned and bolted for the gate. The chamber seemed to warp and shift as he ran, the walls bending and twisting in impossible ways. The figures remained still, watching him with their glowing eyes as he fled. The hum of the gate grew louder again, pulling him toward it, offering him a way out. James threw himself through the gate, tumbling back onto the cold, wet sand of Orford Ness. The air hit him like a slap, bringing him back to reality. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, the sky dark and heavy with clouds. The gate was gone. The signal was gone. But the memory of what he had seen remained. Whatever had come through that rift, whatever ancient force had been unleashed, was still out there. And James knew that it wouldn't be long before it made its presence felt in the world he had left behind. Chapter 4. The Awakening. James sat at his desk, his hands trembling as he stared at the pile of data on his laptop screen. His heart hadn't stopped racing since he had escaped Orford Ness, and the feeling of dread that had clung to him during his encounter in the chamber hadn't let go. He could still see the creature, the shifting, dark mass, with tendrils that writhed and reached as if it were probing the very fabric of space. The moment it had emerged from the monolith was burned into his memory, haunting his thoughts. He had fled back to his research station like a man possessed, his mind barely registering the world around him as he crossed the beach and the desolate stretches of Orford Ness. When he finally reached the small cottage he had rented for his research, He locked the door behind him, as if the flimsy wood could somehow protect him from the horrors he had witnessed. But now, in the quiet solitude of his room, James knew that no door, no barrier could protect him from what had come through that rift. It was out there, somewhere, and it was far more powerful than he could understand. The recordings on his computer mocked him. The signal that had once seemed like a scientific anomaly now carried a dark, sinister weight. He played the file again, listening to the strange, rhythmic hum that had first drawn him to Orford Ness. The sound was no longer just an electromagnetic oddity. It was a warning, and he had ignored it. James tapped out a message to Sarah, his fingers fumbling over the keyboard. She had been right all along. He never should have gone back. He never should have pushed deeper into the mystery. But now that he had, the consequences were already in motion. He sent her a detailed summary of everything that had happened, along with the recordings and data. She deserved to know the truth, even if it put her in danger. There was no going back now. After hitting send, James leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had hoped for answers, but now all he had was a gnawing sense of impending doom. The creature, the monolith, the figures, it was all connected, part of a cosmic puzzle he could barely comprehend. But what scared him most was the feeling that this was only the beginning. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to change. The temperature dropped sharply, and a faint hum began to vibrate through the walls. James froze, his eyes darting around the room. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the hum grew louder, more distinct. It was the same signal, the same vibration that had resonated in his bones when he first stepped onto Orford Ness. Instinctively, he reached for his electromagnetic detector, the one he had used to track the signal at the site. His hand shook as he powered it on. The needle spiked immediately, going off the scale. The air around him crackled with energy, the sound becoming almost unbearable. It was as if the signal were right on top of him, filling the room with its presence. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The shimmering in the air, the distortion that had formed the gateway at Orford Ness was happening again. But this time, it wasn't in the distance, it was right in front of him, inside his own home. The space in the center of the room began to bend, the air warping as if being pulled apart by invisible hands. "No," James whispered, backing away slowly. "Not here." The hum grew louder, filling his ears with its deafening resonance. The shimmering intensified, and once again, the fabric of reality tore open before his eyes. The gate had returned, and through it, James could see the faint outline of the chamber, the monolith standing tall, pulsing with energy, the dark mass lurking in the shadows behind it. His chest tightened with fear as the tendrils began to emerge, snaking their way through the rift, probing the air around them. They were searching, just as they had in the chamber, seeking something or someone. James' breath came in short, ragged gasps as the tendrils reached further into the room, inching closer to him. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, but his feet were frozen to the spot. The oppressive force of the creature's presence pinned him in place, rendering him helpless. And then, just as one of the tendrils was about to touch him, the room went dark. The hum stopped, the shimmering in the air vanished, and the rift closed with a soft pop, leaving James standing in the suffocating silence of his small cottage. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the empty space where the rift had been moments before. It was gone. For now, James staggered to the window, flinging it open to let in the cold night air. He gulped in deep breaths, his head spinning from the sudden change in atmosphere. Outside, the night was calm, the moon casting a faint glow over the landscape. It was as if nothing had happened, but James knew better. The creature had found him. It had come through the rift, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. He didn't know how long he had before it returned, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay here. Without wasting another second, James packed up his equipment, stuffing the most important items into his backpack. He grabbed his car keys and bolted for the door. Whatever was happening at Orford Ness, it was no longer contained to the site. The gate was mobile, and if he stayed in one place, it would find him again. As he drove through the winding coastal roads, his mind raced with the implications of what he had uncovered. He had opened something that should have remained sealed, and now it was out in the world, spreading its influence like a virus. James couldn't shake the feeling that he had become a part of something much larger than himself, a pawn in a game that spanned dimensions. Hours passed as he drove, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting the shimmering rift to appear behind him at any moment. He couldn't rest. He couldn't stop. Not until he figured out what the creature wanted and how to stop it. As the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, James pulled over at a small roadside motel. His body ached with exhaustion, his mind foggy from the adrenaline and fear that had fueled him through the night. He checked into a room, pulling the curtains tightly shut before collapsing onto the bed. But even in sleep, he found no peace. The dreams came almost immediately dark, swirling visions of the monolith and the creature. He saw the figures again, their glowing eyes watching him as the tendrils reached for him, wrapping around his body, pulling him into the rift. He heard the hum, that terrible signal, vibrating through his skull, telling him things in a language he couldn't understand. And then, just before he was consumed by the darkness, he woke with a start. His phone was buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy, disoriented, James reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was a message from Sarah. "James, we need to talk. I found something." James stared at the message, his heart pounding once more. Whatever Sarah had discovered, it was connected to the creature to the rift, and it was more terrifying than he could imagine. As he prepared to call her back, the hum returned, soft at first, but growing louder. The awakening had only just begun.